The task of reviving the image of America, which was shaken by the defeat of the Vietnam War, started with the Rambo films. The story of a war veteran who returns to America after the Vietnam War was brought in First Blood, the first film here, with the role of John Rambo. In its second film, Rambo, an American celluloid hero is born who uses violence and terror as a weapon. Some of the American soldiers who went to the Vietnam War were still prisoners in Vietnam. Rescuing them had only been a dream. After watching this movie, the then US President Ronald Reagan proudly said that a real Rambo should be created to save the American prisoners. But before the heat of that story goes, Oliver Stone, a young man who returned from the Vietnam War, exposes America's nudity, which was being covered with celluloid tapes. Before starting this story, it is necessary to recall the history of Vietnam as briefly as possible. Vietnam, which has a long history, is a country that has been subjected to Chinese invasion several times in the past. In the mid-1800s, the countries of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia fell under French imperialism. They called all these three countries by the single name of Indochina. In World War II, Germany invaded France, so France had to withdraw all its troops. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Japan seized power in Vietnam. An organization is formed to fight against this new invader. It's called the Vietnam Freedom League or Viet Minh. This organization is led by Ho Chi Minh, who is known as the spark of Vietnam's freedom struggle. This organization is rapidly becoming popular among the people of Vietnam. They were well trained in guerrilla warfare. After expelling the Japanese, Ho Chi Minh declares Vietnam an independent state. He succeeds in establishing a communist regime in North Vietnam with Hanoi as the capital. At the moment, France is working to establish a separate state in South Vietnam under a pro-Western leader. Its capital was Saigon. France then entered into a massive war with North Vietnam with the aim of wiping out communism from Vietnam. For this, France received help from America as well. France overestimated its military strength. But the North Vietnamese fighters, who fought with great courage, inflicted a crushing defeat on France. It was 1954. The number of French soldiers who died here is about 8,000. French troops who had been spreading their dominance for almost a century left China and went back. North Vietnam has always received the support of China and Russia. Northern Vietnam had a Buddhist religious orientation. A Catholic religious environment prevailed in pro-Western South Vietnam. The North and the South have always looked at each other with hostility. In order to teach the North a lesson, the rulers of South Vietnam began to harass the remaining Buddhists and monks there. Against these inhuman acts of the government, one monk once set himself on fire in Saigon and died. Within the right-wing South Vietnam itself, a group of people in South Vietnam are rising up against its inhumane rule. They allied themselves with the North Vietnamese Army. That alliance was called National Liberation Front. The National Liberation Front consists of communists and non-communists, but one goal. In 1961, U.S. President John F. Kennedy sent a small group of troops to South Vietnam to provide training and advice to the army. That is how the invasion of America begins. The conflict situation is gradually developing. The United States wanted to suppress the communist regimes that were expanding in Laos as well as in North Vietnam. In 1964, America launched air attacks on both these states. However, with the help of anti-aircraft missiles received from the Soviet government, the Viet Cong guerrillas shot down several American fighter planes. After Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson was the acting president of the United States. In 1965, he sent an American infantry force to Vietnam. It didn't take long for America to understand that it had intervened in a war that should never have intervened. We now turn to our speaker. Oliver Stone is a young man who was born in an educated and important family environment in America. After reaching the right age, he decides to join the U.S. Army. Unfortunately, this inexperienced young man had to go to Vietnam first. America has to fight two sides in Vietnam. That is the Vietcong guerrillas and the North Vietnamese Army that operated in South Vietnam. American troops had to face tactics that they had never faced before. Like the Vietcong guerrillas, the North Vietnamese Army always used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and simultaneous attacks. American troops had to walk for days in the thick jungles of Vietnam in search of their enemy. Especially the American forces were in great difficulty because of the complex tunnel warfare fortification systems used by the Vietnamese fighters. Death suddenly appeared from the ground to the Americans who were looking for enemies in the endless forests. They could not bear the bullets and bombs coming from the demonic possession at an unexpected moment. You can still see the preserved Vietcong guerrilla tunnels if you go to Vietnam today. Death hung constantly over the head of every American soldier in Vietnam. Instead of Vietcong guerrillas, they often met sudden death. Desperate, the American troops eventually found a village and got rid of their hatred. Villages were set on fire, accusing the Vietcong of aiding the guerrillas. Old women, even little girls were raped. Sometimes all the villagers were exterminated. The Americans enjoyed capturing suspicious people and torturing them inhumanely. After doing so, he was finally killed. The American soldiers had become disillusioned with themselves by that time. They always acted as cruel, bloodthirsty. There was not even a trace of humanity left. The hypocrisy had crossed the line. Sometimes they clashed with each other even for trivial things. Oliver Stone realized that he had made a big mistake by joining the army for his country. He was disappointed not only with his fellow soldiers but also with his motherland, America itself. It is more correct to say that it had grown from frustration to hatred. No matter how many killings were done, there was no victory in sight. The United States decides to evacuate civilians in a large area in South Vietnam and shoot at every moving target in that area. But they couldn't move forward with any of those strategies. Americans who saw no benefit in the Vietnam War, which is spending their tax money and sacrificing the lives of American youth, start protesting against their government. Realizing that its famous military history is being discredited in front of the world, the American government starts a massive media suppression. Nearly 60 journalists who reported the Vietnam War are killed by America. They are trying to portray their lost Vietnam War as a war that is close to victory. In March 1968, more than 400 unarmed civilians were massacred by the American Army in My Lai area. In 1970, the Americans joined the South Vietnamese Army and invaded Laos and Cambodia with the aim of blocking North Vietnam's supply lines. Protests against America's action are intensifying in America itself. A large number of American university students who led these protests are killed by the American police. This makes the situation in America even hotter. France, which had made Vietnam its colony for 87 years from 1858 to 1945, justified it by saying that it was their responsibility to help civilize the underdeveloped areas of Asia. Likewise, the United States, which invaded Vietnam for nearly 20 years from 1955 to 1975, justified its invasion by saying that it was a measure taken to prevent the Communists from taking over South Vietnam. But by that time, the American government had realized that the Vietnam War would never be won. Thousands of coffins covered with the American flag were coming to America. The leaders of the country decide to put aside the shame and call back the American troops. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong guerrillas defeat the pro-Western South Vietnamese Army and capture Saigon. In the United Vietnam, Saigon is known as Ho Chi Minh City. Over 58,000 American soldiers died in this war. Similarly, over 2 million civilians and over 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong guerrillas had died. We turn again to our speaker. Oliver Stone's experience in Vietnam was extremely shocking. Because of this, he became addicted to alcohol to the point of unconsciousness. He quits the military service he hated. He had many things to tell the world. He first joined the film industry as a screenwriter. He won an Academy Award in 1978 for his screenplay for Midnight Express. Then he decides to step into film direction. He directed a film in 1986, collecting all the unpleasant events he had experienced in Vietnam. The name is Platoon. With this film, the world policeman who searches for human rights in other countries comes to an end. If you really want to know what happened in Vietnam, find out. Not Rambo. Platoon.